Good morning, everyone. My name is Vikramaditya, and today I'm going to present my paper on onboard analysis of uncalibrated data uh, for a spacecraft at Mars. So this paper talks about mining data, trying to learn from data that is collected by the spacecraft that is orbiting Mars. And before we go into the paper, a few things about the Martian climate is Mars is actually a carbon dioxide based planet, and it's though it has a little content of oxygen and water, majorly it's a carbon dioxide based planet. And the second thing to note is about the temperature ranges. It actually varies from around minus 250 degree Celsius to around 20 degrees Celsius, averaging about minus 140 degrees Celsius, which is equivalent to around minus 220 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a little about the Martian climatic conditions. And so as we go on, the major challenges in the paper are, so as we go on, we look at noise in the data and trying to having an overhead of computational and memory resources. So these are the major problems, identified problems, and the paper falls in the category of mining data collected. So it's basically spacecraft on board mining and learning. And this paper approaches the problem of trying to analyze the climatic and geographical conditions on Mars using mining and learning approach. So as we go on, we look at this data was from the Mars Odyssey spacecraft in particular, which was launched in 2001. And the major purpose of this particular aircraft was to go ahead and look and search for water resources, whether there exists water, and basically proof of life on Mars. And this particular spacecraft is equipped with a couple of instruments or devices. One of them is the thermal emission imaging system, which is a multi-wavelength camera, which is called THEMIS, and it's basically a fusion of two cameras. One is a visual camera and the other is an infrared camera. So this is the majority of the analysis or the work done in the paper focuses using this. Apart from this, there is also radiation measuring device, and there is a gamma spectrometer also fitted into the spacecraft. So that's a little about it. And the major problems handled in this paper are thermal anomaly detection and polar ice cap tracking and aerosol opacity analysis or estimation. So as we go on, the first problem that is looked upon is the thermal anomaly detection. So we're trying to use the infrared camera and extract the particular image, and we try to analyze what are the anomalies across. So where are these big thermal differences caused? And they also do define thermal anomaly as a region on the surface temperature where there is either an extreme or a minimum temperature seen, which is different from a normal temperature. And we do see that the way they approach it is they actually do a pixel to temperature conversion and temperature to pixel conversion, which is pretty much a heuristic process that they have developed. That in the paper they do not really dig down into it, but they say that it's actually more a manual process put in. And they also say that this depends on the season, temperature, and other parameters, and is basically computed in the ground. This particular computation can be done in the ground and sent across. That's basically what they try to talk about. And so that's about it. And they go about using this, try to define a threshold, as I've said, based on the values. They define a threshold and use this to calculate or compute and analyze the anomaly on the identified images that are taken by the craft. And we go about and see that the images that were used, the were around 15,000 of them, and it did identify 143 images to have anomalies, but as there in reality there aren't any anomalies, so they were kind of flagged off as they were just flagged off, but still they actually pointed towards being an interesting source to look at by the domain experts. They did go about, picked it up, and found a couple of things interesting, and are looking into it. And apart from this, they also tested this on synthetic data, and they found that the technique that they applied did a fairly good job. The second problem that they did go about is trying to use polar cap edge detection. When we go back and look at the Mars surface here, we see that there are two huge polar caps, one on the north and south, and the problem is trying to identify the edge, or trying to look at where how does the edge variation happen over seasons. So there are, during the cold season, they have the ice caps are huge, humongous in size, and as the season slowly goes on, they wear off. So we try to use try to go about trying to we again go back and use the IR images for analyzing this. So this actually has a couple of steps. Calibration, they talk about calibration. This is an optional component where they try to convert pixel image into temperature so that they could use with more accuracy. Calibration is something like this. Let's take an example. We have a camera, and we know that it's a RBG camera, and we take a photograph of it, and then if it is uncalibrated, it implies that the image that we get out, the final product that we get out of the camera, need not have the 100% accurate color encoded on them. There can be very slight variation, so that's called uncalibrated. So that's a very, very naive example of it. So one, that the uncalibration needs to be handled. The second thing is they actually use a dynamic threshold. They go about drawing temperature histograms on the data that gets, and based on the local maxima and minima identified, they try to compute dynamically the threshold which can be used as a measure for identifying the edges, the edge detection to happen. So the cap edge identification, the last step is they did identify that it gets thinner and thinner as slowly it varies over time. And another thing to note is this data was collected for an year, and that is basically being used. So that's basically they've observed. They did observe that after a certain point of time, around 50% of the region that gets covered by the polar ice, which is nothing but carbon dioxide ice, gets 50% of it gets, as the season progresses, gets defrozen. So the conclusion, the results of this particular experiment, they did try to compare this process of model they've developed to a manual comparison, and secondly, they've actually compared it with an existing technique developed for such systems using spatial resolution, lowering the spatial resolution. They did try to compare their technique, and they did identify that with the manual computation, where manually the edges were determined how it progressed over time. It actually agreed to it with 93.3%, and the other one was agreed to be at around 96.3%. And when they were actually looking for anomalous states in between, they did identify that there was one particular state which was which did just popped out of nowhere, and this indicated to a point that there was a water ice conversion that existed, and so they had to take back the images, and as they couldn't figure out, and the domain experts did point out, saying that that's exactly where the water ice was, the frozen ice was getting converted to water. So the water ice analysis was also determined. And then we go back and look at one of the finding as how the edge detection gets particularly done. And the next experiment that we have in place is the aerosol opacity estimation, which is nothing, we're trying to determine the amount of the depth of ice and dust in the air. So when we go back and look, we know that the atmosphere is divided into certain layers, and we see that certain layers have dust and ice as a part of them. So we go back and try to look from the satellite, is there a way that we can actually predict? We go back and look at, understand the depth of ice and dust particles, and is there a way we could go back and predict them? So that's basically the problem that they are looking at. And so they go ahead and apply regression technique. They go back using a support vector machine with a Gaussian kernel, and they go back and use that. And due to the computational cost, they identify that this can be there could be a fast approximation applied on it, and it can be reduced. And they apply a reduced set support vector machine, where they reduce the number of support vectors to help it to have the same output as the support vector machine, the original support vector machine, but with a minimum number of support vectors. So that's about it. So they reduced, they identified around 1,800 vectors originally, and they reduced it to 40 vectors for ice and for dust both. And they go back and they apply it. So they totally had a data set of around 200,000 labeled framelets. They identified it as framelets and they used it. And the training set consisted of just 2,200, and the test set was around 200,000. So it was like 220,000 was used for the entire process. And they did identify that the support vector machine and the reduced set SVM were pretty close by, was pretty good. And when we go back and look at the diagram, this is a better view of the image that was actually extracted. So we go back, and when we look at this particular image, the blue parts on it are pretty much the ice, and the other red ones are slight dust layers, and then the vegetation and so on. So, I'm sorry, there's no vegetation on Mars. Oh gosh. And as we go back and look at no vegetation on Mars yet. So this is a simple example of the image extraction. Another thing to note that this is from the visual camera, not the IR camera, because IR camera may not. It is identified that it may not do a good job extracting the ice and water level information. So that's a little about this. And there was also a study done on this, and the results were published manually. And then they did this experiment had a prediction component, and as it predicted, there was a manual comparison. So the lower one that you see on this end is the real one from the study, and this is a predicted, and they actually had a high accuracy in predicting it. So after this, the next step was to go back and deploy it on a test bed and see how it does in real time, which is very nearly equivalent to the real time. And they used a PPC 750 chipset and the motherboard and the layout, and which was run on the VS-Works operating system. The only difference here is that this particular test bed had 100% control on the processor, and they actually had some additional memory that they can actually go back and work. So apart from that, it was pretty much very similar. Some of the future work here is to port it to the spacecraft that are going to be launched next. So it is a successful application they have determined, and this had some promising results, and also was raised some curious and interesting pointers for domain experts and scientists. And apart from this, it actually didn't meet the requirements that they were looking for, and and as it sounded promising, they're taking forward and taking it to the next step. But a couple of critical thoughts here would be, the first one would be could there be a method which can help move the process of calculating the thresholds for experiment in 1 and 2? Can that be more standardized? The second one could be SVM, we did notice that there are seasonal changes that affect the dust and ice. So why not a time series based regression? Why don't that be applied in this particular scenario? These are a few open-ended questions that can enhance this particular work. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and have a nice day. And I would be available for questions over the phone. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.